Okay, I think I'll make a start now. I'm aware we're expecting quite a few more people, but obviously you're all here, so let's get started with the people that are here, and hopefully some others will join us soon. So good morning and welcome. Hopefully you're in the right place today. We will be covering policies for supported accommodation providers. So just to introduce myself, my name's Kath. I'm an independent safeguarding consultant and trainer, delivering this training session today on behalf of the NCB. My background is as a children and family social worker. It's where I spent many years of my career. I've worked with children through all the different levels of support, from early help through child in need and child protection, and working with children who are looked after. A strong background in supporting organisations also with their policy and procedure development and making sure that they're meeting all of their statutory requirements. So that's a little bit about me. You've got the chat here. If anyone does want to say hi in the chat and say where they're from, you're very welcome to do that. So in terms of the slides that I'm going to be sharing with you today, you will see as we go through, there's quite a lot of information included. The slides will be shared after the sessions, alongside that accompanying learner handbook, which is also available, and that's all available on the Programme to Micro site, so you can access there. But we will pop into the chat that learner handbook, so we will be using that learner chat handbook today, so you will need to have access to that. So particularly when we're looking at the scenarios later, we'll be using the scenarios within that handbook, but it's a really excellent resource. It's got lots of information in there covering all the things that I'm speaking about today and more in terms of the other required policies and procedures that you need to have in place as a supported accommodation provider. So in terms of using Teams today, if you can just make sure that you're on mute when you're not speaking. Obviously in the breakout rooms, you will be required to have a conversation with colleagues in there. I'll speak a little bit more about the layout of the day in those breakout rooms in a minute. Please feel free to use that chat function to ask questions. Now we have very helpfully, we have Raisa and Danya here from the NCB team that are supporting me today. Raisa will be keeping an eye on that chat, and if she's able to provide any answers within the chat, she will do. If not, I will periodically have a look at that chat and have a look at any particular questions I might be able to pick up on. Anything that we can't answer today, we will take away and endeavour to get answers back. So not individually, but by providing some follow-up information. We're running a number of these sessions, so there's likely to be key themes that come up throughout that we'll be able to provide some information answering any of those. But I will endeavour to answer anything I can today, but just the caveat, if there isn't anything that I can, we will do our best to get that information for you. So in terms of raising the hand function, if you'd like to speak, on the whole through the session, I won't be able to take individual questions because although we're quite a small group at the moment, we're looking to expand up to quite a few participants today. But when we do some feedback after the scenarios, I really will be encouraging people to just to talk at that point, and then in that point you can be using that raise hand function, so we can make sure everyone gets to say what they want to say in terms of that feedback. The training will be obviously looking at safeguarding policies and procedures, and we're going to be considering some scenarios, and then therefore we may be referring to some themes that any delegate may find upsetting due to some of the topic matter, such as things like self-harm and exploitation and mental health difficulties and drug use and other forms of harm to children. So being just taking care of yourselves wherever you are, whether you're at home or at work. If any of the content becomes difficult for you, obviously, hopefully you know where to get some help and guidance around that. So just a bit of an overview to the day. So this is sort of generally where we're expecting to be in terms of timings, but we've run one session earlier in the week, and whilst we do stick to the timings as much as possible for the lunch and break, and we certainly don't overrun, it might not go completely to the minute of those timings. As I said, we won't overrun today. We finished up nice with good time on the session earlier in the week. So just doing some introductions at the moment and welcoming. Then we're going to be looking at that legal framework, and will be the first policy we're going to be looking at is a safeguarding policy. Then we're having a break. At around 11:10 we'll be having a short break. Then we'll be having a look at the missing child policy and the behaviour management policy. Once you've had a look at those 3 policies, then you'll be going into breakout rooms, and you have a good session, really, some time to have a look at 3 scenarios based around those 3 different policies. And this is a really good opportunity for you to kind of think about how your policies and procedures would support you in certain scenarios. So this should help you in developing those policies. So those are interactive sessions. Hopefully you're able to use your mic. If not, then in those breakout rooms, you can use the chat function to make sure that you have your input. And for each of those, I think we've got, sorry, just apologies, I think we've got someone not on mute. If we can just make sure everyone's muted. And for each of those breakout rooms, for each of the groups, we'll be having small groups within there. If we can have someone that's really brave and put themselves forward as being a feedback person, I will be asking for some verbal feedback at the end from the group, so we can have a bit of a hear about how other people tackled that, and opportunities for anyone else to kind of put in any information they'd like to discuss at that point. Then after that breakout session, we will be having a lunch break. And when we return from lunch, we're going to be looking at the statement of purpose and young people's case records. And then we'll have another breakout room session. So same as before. And there's 2 scenarios this time in which we will be discussing and getting some feedback and some discussion around those. And at the end of the day, just a bit of a recap and any further questions. So the aim of the day is to support providers of supported accommodation with the development of key policies that are required by the quality standards, and there'll be a focus on the statement of purpose, safeguarding behaviour management and missing child's policies, and looking at young people's case records. So the learning objectives of the day. So it's to provide providers of supported accommodation with information so that you can have increased understanding of the requirements of the key policies that are set out in the regulations and the quality standards. To help providers of supported accommodation have increased awareness of the legal framework underpinning the policies and other related statutory and non-statutory guidance, and for providers to have increased confidence in developing your own policies and procedures and increased understanding of how these policies can be put into practice by exploring a range of scenarios relating to young people living in supported accommodation. I should have just said at the outset, we are recording the session today, but this is at the moment is for internal purposes, so that we can just ensure that we get all of the feedback and information coming out of these sessions, so that we can make sure that we get everything answered that needs to be answered following all of the training sessions. So I'd like to take the opportunity at this point at the start of the training to refresh our memories of the key principles, and these are what young people told us that they need from supported accommodation. And as we go through these policies, I really hope that you'll be able to see how these will be relevant to the policies that we must have in place, and sort of help you understand the why, so we can be fully supporting young people. So the principles are that I feel safe and secure where I live and within my wider environment, that my voice is respected and heard and advocated for, so I can influence the support that I receive, that I have a confidence that the adults who support me understand me, are skilled and work effectively together to best meet my needs. I have my own space that I feel proud of, and I live in a comfortable, well-maintained and stable accommodation. I receive high quality tailored support that sustains my health and well-being. I have strong, trusting and meaningful relationships within my support system and can rely on the adults around me. I feel supported to learn and apply skills for independent adult living, and I feel positive about my future and opportunities as a result of the support I receive. Throughout the day, I will be mainly using the term young people, but I will also be using the term child and children. The reason I'll be using the term young people is to respect the feedback received from young people themselves, that this is the preferred term for them when they are 16 or 17 years old. However, it's really important to remember they are still children in the eyes of the law, and the protections that apply to all children apply to these young people. The guide informs us that it is clear that these young people are still children and must be considered and treated as such. The guidance requires a number of policies to be in place, and whilst we'll be focusing on 5 of these today, the learner handbook that you have that's on that microsite and that we've put into the chat as well, contains explanations of all of the different policies required to support you and how to support you in drafting these. Feedback from the Sector Awareness and Provider Preparedness Programme Sector Intelligence Baseline Survey demonstrated that providers were interested in further training around the safeguarding policies and procedures, and these are the 4 policies that are required under that protection standard. And we've also included the statement of purpose. It's a key document, it's overarching and it's really comprehensive, and it sets out what your service offers, and it acts as a reference point for local authorities and young people and other relevant organisations. At this point at the start, I'd really like to just sort of talk through the very basics around policies and procedures really, and noting the difference between policies and procedures. If you think about your policies as the why, so it's the legal framework and the links to your statutory and non-statutory guidance, for example, and these will be very similar across all providers. But then underneath this will be your procedures. So if you think about this as the how, the procedures that you have in place that you expect to be followed, and these will differ from provider to provider, although they will obviously be some similarities across. Therefore, it's important that your policies should include both policy and also the relevant overarching procedures as well. You may also set out more detailed procedures in separate documents. For example, if you have more than one form of accommodation, then your procedures for each of those settings are likely to vary, but the overarching principles would remain the same. And your main policies need to refer to any localised procedures that you may have in place within your different settings if you're running more than one type of setting. There's no single piece of legislation, but rather there's a myriad of different laws and guidance that are relevant to safeguarding and promoting the welfare of children in England. And I'll be going through a brief overview of these that are relevant to your services. However, it's really important that you have knowledge of the legal frameworks and have read and understood the statutory guidance documents to ensure that you're compliant with them. These are all referenced within the Learner Handbook, where we've set out all of the required policies and the relevant statutory and non-statutory guidance against each standard. The Supported Accommodation England Regulations 2023, the regulations define the quality standards that all providers must meet, as well as detail on the Ofsted-led inspections and the regulation regime. When I use the term regulations today, this is what I'm referring to. Within the regulations, the quality standards are really essential to that framework for supported accommodation. They set out the different outcomes that providers must meet for young people in supported accommodation, and they allow for flexibility in how this is achieved, recognising that individual young people have different support needs and therefore require different degrees and forms of support. By complying with the quality standards, providers can demonstrate that they deliver high quality services that meet the needs of young people in supported accommodation. The Children Act sets out the specific responsibilities for the young person's accommodating authority for safeguarding children and young people who are looked after, and this will include care planning and placement in case of view, and sets out the specific responsibilities of local authorities in exercising their social services functions for supporting care leavers, so planning for transition into adulthood and for care leavers. The Care Standards Act provides for the administration of a variety of care institutions, and it was introduced to regulate and ensure that providers are competent in their duty of care. Section 23 sets out the national minimum standards. So those were our laws, and this is our guidance that sits under those laws. So we have key guidance. The first one that you really need to make sure that you have read and understood is the Guide to the Supported Accommodation Regulations, including those quality standards. And this is a statement which is published pursuant to Section 23 of the Care Standards Act 2000, and explains and supplements the regulations that I mentioned on that previous slide. Provides explanations of terms used within regulations, and it sets out what is expected in order to meet those various requirements of the regulations. It also signposts into additional relevant statutory and non-statutory guidance. So when I use the term of guidance today, this is what I'm talking about. Working Together to Safeguard Children 2018, currently under consultation, so there will be an updated version later this year, so do look out for that. The consultation documents out there at the moment, and this sets out the duties and responsibilities for all local authorities and others who deliver children's services regarding to safeguarding children and young people. It sets out how individuals and organisations should work together, so good multi-agency working in order to safeguard and protect the welfare of children and young people in accordance with the relevant legislation. We have the Information Sharing Guidance 2018. This is also currently out for consultation at the moment, so there will be an updated version coming out soon, so do have a look at that consultation document. This is a non-statutory document and it's been produced to support practitioners in decisions that you may need to take regarding information sharing about children and young people, something that often people do require advice and guidance on. We're going to be referring to this later today when we talk about things like case records and any other records that you're going to be keeping about children. We have statutory guidance on children who run away or go missing from home or care, and this sets out the steps that local authorities and their partners need to take in order to prevent children from going missing and in order to protect them when they do go missing. And we're going to cover this more later when we'll look at that missing child policy. And the final one here, the National Protocol on Reducing Unnecessary Criminalisation of Looked After Children and Care Leavers, provides a good framework for best practice to prevent the criminalisation of looked after children and care leavers where possible and appropriate. So our child protection policies, we're going to be going on to consider these first. The DfE guidance includes within this the safeguarding policy, the missing child policy and the behaviour management policies. All of your policies need to be tailored to the needs of the cohort within your setting, and they need to be shared with staff as part of a really comprehensive safeguarding induction process, and we'll talk about that later. All of your policies and procedures need to be accessible to young people as well. So these safeguarding policies and procedures. So think about how you can make them accessible to young people in a format that they will understand. So you may wish to consider, for example, writing a child-friendly version of some of your policies so that young people really understand the expectations, what you have to do for them, what they're expected to do, what actions are going to be taken in certain circumstances, and essentially how they're going to be protected. The aim of the safeguarding policy and those linked policies that we're going to be going through are about ensuring that young people living within supported accommodation and accessing services are safe and protected from harm, and that appropriate actions are taken when concerns arise. And these policies, as I said, they need to be tailored to the needs of each cohort within your setting. So the protection standard sets out that we need to enable children to feel safe and that their needs are met, and it requires the registered person to ensure that children are protected from harm, that they're enabled to keep themselves safe, that they have their individual needs met, and also that they have 24-hour access to help in a crisis or emergency situation. So settings in which there isn't a adult present 24 hours a day. What can young people do if there's a crisis or emergency situation and there's no adult present at the setting? What steps do they need to take to get in contact with someone? So safeguarding is defined within Working Together to Safeguard Children 2018. That statutory guidance that I said is currently under consultation. The safeguarding element in terms of the meaning of it is not likely to change. So it's about protecting children from maltreatment, preventing impairment of their mental and physical health and development, ensuring that children grow up in circumstances consistent with the provision of safe and effective care, and that's everywhere that they spend time, not just within accommodation, but with when they're out and about, any organisations they come into contact with, and taking action to enable all children to have the best outcomes. So safeguarding is something active, it's actions that we take. The guidance talks about safeguarding culture and ethos, where young people are listened to, where they're respected, and where they're involved within service development and involved in decisions making within the service. Safeguarding culture goes beyond that tick box approach of just your policies and procedures and meeting those statutory requirements. Obviously, statutory requirements must be met, and if they're not met, then we could consider that young people could be at risk. But a strong safeguarding culture goes beyond that. Think about it as a thread that runs through everything that you're doing, every aspect of your organisation, and it will be reflected in your environments and in your practices. Really important that staff are knowledgeable and confident in keeping young people safe and know how to respond to concerns when they arise. And we want obviously young people to feel safe within settings and to understand those different responsibilities towards them and the responsibilities of others towards, and their own responsibilities, of course, to keeping themselves safe as well. So safeguarding and child protection, they are terms we often use interchangeably, but just it's important to understand they do mean different things. So safeguarding, think about it as a big umbrella covering all of those within your organisation. So all of the young people accommodated, but your staff as well, with the actions that we take to protect everyone from harm. And when we're talking about safeguarding for young people, it's those actions that we're taking for all of them to keep them safe. And that will include the things, the procedures that we're following within our settings. Child protection is one part underneath that big umbrella. And these are the actions that we take when we have specific concerns for children and young people. So this is where we're identifying that they are highly likely to suffer from a significant harm or suffering from significant harm. The guidance reminds us that it's imperative that all children within supported accommodation settings are safe places, within safe places, and they need to be places where children are protected from harm, where their individual needs are met. It also reminds us of the inherent vulnerabilities of some of the young people who are going to be living within that supported accommodation. Looked after children and care leavers are often some of the most vulnerable children and young people in society, and it's really important that we work together, do everything that we can do to ensure that they have access to suitable accommodation and that their needs can be met and that they can be kept safe. For young people who are ready for it, high quality supported accommodation, providing a nurturing and protective environment, can be a place where they can thrive and prepare for greater independence. It's really important that each policy clearly sets out your arrangements for safeguarding of young people, how you're going to safeguard them from harm and abuse and neglect, issues such as criminal sexual exploitation, and the policies need to contain your services procedures. How are you going to act on those concerns if they arise, as well as providing that preventative information for young people as well? How are you going to respond to child protection concerns if they arise, and how will you be notifying the appropriate authorities? And as I said, it's not just the actions we take, thinking about those preventative measures that you have in place as well, in order to protect children from harm in the first place. And that's really important. We try to protect first and obviously then react if situations of concern arise. So we'll be going through these different policy elements that are set out. So the safeguarding policy relates to Regulation 20 of the protection standards in the DfE guidance, and it states that the registered person must prepare and implement a policy which intends to safeguard children from abuse and neglect, and will contain these different sections. So this is what I'm going to be going through with you, working through each of those sections and supporting you to think about what you maybe already have in place and how you're going to get that into your policies and procedures, or strengthening things that you have in place already. Or if there's areas where you think actually this is an area we need to work on, then you'll be taking note of things that you need to make sure that you're including within there. So we need to make sure, obviously, that we have within our policies the things that we're going to do should there be a report of harm or abuse. Should a young person or an adult or anyone else raise a concern that a young person is at risk of harm or is being harmed. So we need to think about staff reporting procedures. What do you have in place, or will you have in place? What are those mechanisms for staff reporting concerns? Who are they going to report those concerns to? And how are those records going to be kept? We'll look later today more at case records, but all records need to be kept of any concerns that have been raised. How are you going to keep those records securely? So this is people's private confidential information, so keeping those records securely. They're only shared with those that need that information, but also when we look at information sharing later today, actually understanding that good information sharing is really important in order to protect children and young people. So thinking about what those records look like, or the records that you want to develop, and how you clearly explain them within your policies and procedures. So someone working within your setting or a young person can clearly see that those are the responsibilities and this is what will happen. You need to think about what you have in place, or what you will have in place if a young person has a concern about themselves or another young person within that setting. what will they need to do? Who will they contact? How will that information be gathered? And thinking about how you tailor that to the needs of the young people within that accommodation. So there may need to be multiple ways for young people to report concerns. Not all young people are ready to report concerns verbally. You may need to have other ways, written ways, or depending on their method of communication, ensuring that they are listened to. You need to have procedures for responding to these concerns. So what are you going to do when concerns are raised? Who are you going to inform? So this could be current concerns or ongoing concerns. Equally, it could be historic concerns that come to your attention as well. All of these may need to be reported onto the accommodation authority or into the local authority in which your setting is, both if they are separate, different authorities. And you need to think about how the registered person or staff are going to liaise with local authorities, social workers and others in relation to child protection inquiries when they do come up, and how you're going to share information well with them and work together well with them, and thinking about that good multi-agency working that comes through working together to safeguard children. We also need to make sure that we've got measures in place to protect young people should they make an allegation against another person as well. How will they be protected? Staff induction and training. Staff training is incredibly important. That's making sure that staff have those skills that are needed and that they're refreshed regularly. And we need to keep a good record of training as well. And training for staff is going to be recorded within that workforce plan. So your safeguarding policy needs to set out what training is going to be provided to staff from induction and how often this is going to be refreshed. So think about what would be the best training for your staff to have in terms of safeguarding and child protection, so they've got a good knowledge of things like those signs, symptoms and indicators, opportunities to think about what that will look like within the young people within the accommodation. How may they notice these things? How are they going to respond if a concern is raised? So they've got that really good understanding. So that's important we set that out within the policy. And as I said, thinking about how often that's refreshed as well. Under the protection standard, the guidance sets out that the different skills and knowledge that staff should have in order to be able to protect and support young people. And the guidance says that staff should be skilled to recognise the signs and provide support to young people in danger of or involved in exploitative or damaging relationships with others, and where appropriate, be able to provide guidance and advice to young people in order to support themselves to keep themselves safe. Guidance says that staff should have the relevant skills and knowledge to identify safeguarding risks and early signs of poor mental health, and they need to know how to take action and how to escalate concerns if they feel that existing resources aren't available or aren't flexible enough to meet that young person's needs. Sets out that staff should be aware of any additional risks that may be present in the event of an emergency placement. So this could include situations in which staff may have very limited information on that young person if they've been placed in your setting as an emergency. And they should have those relevant skills and knowledge to be able to appropriately manage that risk and to take action. Statutory guidance on children running away states that staff working with looked after children should be trained and supported to offer a consistent approach to the care of children. And this includes being proactive about strategies to prevent children from running away, and also to understand those procedures that must be followed if a child goes missing. When identifying risks for young people or following a particular course of action, staff should discuss that risk or concern with the young person and agree steps with them to mitigate this from happening in the future. So thinking about how young people can be supported to keep them safe, to keep others safe, as well as thinking about things such as other support services that can be brought in order to safeguard that young person. And staff need to work with other agencies where appropriate to help support young people to understand the risks that they may face. This will include things like risk-taking behaviour, and really building on and supporting that young person's strengths and skills, supporting young people to make better informed decisions moving forward. So as it says here, in terms of the advice and guidance, how do we provide advice and guidance to young people on how to keep themselves safe? This will including understanding what abuse is. When we think about things like exploitation, when young people are exploited, they often don't acknowledge themselves as experiencing abuse or being victims. So actually working closely with them to understand that and those signs that they should hopefully be encouraged to notice. how they can report concerns, if they have concerns about abuse about themselves or others, how they can be supported to report that, and understanding the importance of passing on those concerns. How we support young people thinking about their relationships, developing those healthy and nurturing relationships moving forward, and really looking at that young person's strengths and skills that they already have. How are we going to build on them and support them moving forward, supporting them into adulthood in terms of making those informed decisions. Need to be able to support young people to manage their own safety inside the setting but outside of the setting. We're developing independence for young people, so these are skills they need into adulthood. They may need to think about what other support or services may be required for young people, and obviously working with some other services as well when required in order to support understanding of those risks. Guidance is really clear that we should be involving young people within decision making, and staff should be encouraging young people to express their views about whether they feel safe within that setting or whether they feel safe when they're outside of that setting. And it's important that staff really strive to build positive relationships with young people, and we'll touch on positive and strong relationships as we go through the day-to-day and the importance of those good relationships build up that culture of openness and honesty and trust, and that really encourages young people to tell someone if they've got concerns, talk about any worries that they have for their safety and well-being. And within the young person's guide that you'll be producing, you should be providing information on how young people can contact their accommodating authority if they want to ask for a review of their care or pathway plan, or if they have any concerns to their safety or their welfare. And settings must ensure that young people understand how they can speak to others, such as independent advocates, independent reviewing officers, their personal advisor, Ofsted inspectors, and any other relevant people that they may need to speak to if they have any concerns about their own safety. Working together to safeguard children states that all organisations and agencies working with children should have clear policies in place for dealing with allegations against people who work with children. And within your policy, you need to make it clear there's a distinction between an allegation, a concern about the quality of care or practice, or a complaint. And the supported accommodation guidance states that supervision of staff practice should ensure that staff understand what they'd need to do if they found that another member of staff was misusing or abusing their position to the detriment to the safety of a young person. So what would you expect staff to do if they had concerns about the behaviour of other members of staff? That part of your safeguarding policy will need to be in line with your local authority arrangements. So essentially it will set out how you would refer into the local authority designated officer if an allegation against a staff member is made. So that's going to obviously include details of that local authority designated officer that we often refer to as the LADO. And so the contact details should be within those policies and procedures. And obviously, if you've got a number of different settings in different areas, making sure it's really clear for each setting who they'd need to contact. Any allegation that's made against a member of staff needs to be informed to Ofsted as well, and that's in line with Regulation 27, which is the notification of serious incidents. So thinking about who needs to be involved if an allegation is made against a member of staff. Including this within your staff training, so they're really clear about their responsibilities. You may have really small, close staff teams that get on well with each other, and it can be really hard to think about another member of staff working there, that maybe their actions that they're taking aren't in the best interest of children. So staff need to be really explained clearly at induction and through training. Their responsibilities, if they have concerns, are all part of that keeping young people safe, but also young people understand if they have concerns about staff, what they need to do as well. Thinking about things like those imbalances of power between young people and staff members, and how that might impact on and create some barriers to young people wanting to report concerns, particularly if they think it might upset the stability of their placement, how they're going to be supported if they do make an allegation against a member of staff in a small setting, for example, how you support that young person so they can continue remaining within that accommodation and feeling safe and still have those good relationships with others. Online safety is something we all have to think about nowadays. It's really important that we consider it, and the guidance is really clear. Young people should have autonomy over their use of technology. However, it's really vital that staff are aware through training some of the risks to young people online. So as well as through training, they're understanding some of the contextual risks in the local area, for example, that they may be experiencing, or things that young people may face out and about, or even within the setting. They need to understand what risks young people face online as well. And there's a real range of risks online. The harms that they experience can be really complex. They can be really wide-ranging. They're often quite nuanced as well. And the severity of the harm can vary between children. So from some, it could be quite a minimal impact, such as a bit of emotional upset or a bit of confusion or some short-term anger. Equally, can sometimes lead to long-term changes in their behaviour and quite deep emotional impacts, including things like social withdrawal and self-harm. So where appropriate, staff should be providing advice to young people on how to stay safe online and signposting them. There's lots of additional information out there through a number of strong organisations around the country, and national and local organisations with information about online safety that you can provide to young people. And obviously that staff awareness is really key, that they're aware of those risks and aware where those harms can happen, as well as understanding that actually the internet and the online world is a real positive for many young people as well. So it's not just about the harms. Actually, there can be positive connections made through the internet, and it can be a positive space, but there are those harms we need to be aware of. Your statement of purpose your policies in relation to self-harm and suicide should reflect your statement of purpose. And records of any self-harming or incidents must be kept, and you must be informing the relevant authorities if information needs to be shared, so such as with the accommodation authority or other necessary professionals. So considering that good information sharing guidance that we're going to talk about later. If a young person is self-harming or has thoughts of self-harm or suicide, then you need to make sure that staff support that young person in order to access suitable professional support, in order to help keep that young person safe, and also to help them better understand maybe previous experiences that they've had or behaviours of self-harm, if that's applicable to that young person. If any changes are going to be made in terms of the support package or accommodation arrangements because of self-harm or because of concerns around suicide, then that young person needs to be fully involved within that decision-making process. So your record keeping and your information sharing, we'll obviously be looking later at case records, but it's important that your safeguarding policy sets out the records that you're going to be keeping in relation to safeguarding young people, thinking about your retention as well, how long you're going to be retaining those records for, and setting that out within there. Should also be setting out the key principles around information sharing, so thinking about that guidance, DfE guidance about information sharing, thinking about how we need to share information with others for the purposes of safeguarding young people. So we'll look at that a bit more later. Staff need to share relevant information and decisions with young person's accommodating authority at times, and where appropriate with other professionals as well. So you need to be thinking about those boundaries there. And staff need to inform that young person if there's any information sharing, and explain the reasons behind information sharing in most situations, because young people should be fully involved within things that are happening for them. Within your safeguarding policy, you need to have a section on whistleblowing. So this needs to set out how staff can report concerns that maybe a young person is at risk of or experiencing significant harm within the setting, so to do with the setting, or any dangerous or illegal activity or any other wrongdoing within the organisation. And all organisations need to have clear whistleblowing procedures in place, so staff feel confident to raise concerns. And the guidance specifies that the procedures should be reflective of the principles that are set out within the Francis Review, Freedom to Speak Up. So do have a look at that review, but it talks about cultures within organisations and having strong cultures around safety, where staff feel confident to raise concerns, where staff feel that they are free from bullying. There should be that visible leadership, and staff need to feel valued, and staff and leaders all need to have opportunities to reflect within their practice. Appropriate investigations need to be undertaken when concerns are raised, and there needs to be mediation and dispute resolution procedures in place. And through training, staff need to understand the responsibilities that they have for raising concerns and be provided with appropriate training in order to undertake their roles fully and completely understand what their responsibilities are. And within all organisations, we want those really good and strong cultures of transparency and accountability. So in the microsite, there's a document which looks at some key questions that you might want to consider when developing your policy, just to kind of talk you through it really. So it's just as an additional resource really. So in each of the sections for each of the policies, there's a few questions that are asked, and they will cover things like the policies, the processes and procedures and recording, support that will be provided for young people, the safe staff induction and training, how you're covering multi-agency working and whistleblowing, but it's written as a set of questions, essentially just to help you. So for example, under the safeguarding policy, questions will include things like how can young people report concerns for themselves or others. So you'll be thinking about what procedures you have in place or what you want to put in place. What procedures are in place for managing allegations or concerns involving staff? So how are you going to develop them or further strengthen them or make them very clear within that policy? How will young people who self-harm be supported? What procedures you have in place for whistleblowing? They're just an example of some of the questions that are set out within there. So I'm just going to take a moment to have a look in the chat. So bear with me a moment.
Kath, I can edit you to a question if you'd like.
Oh yes, okay, please, yeah.
Yes, we just had questions around so one around Gian asking, interested in thoughts on how we balance the desire for safe and effective care with the fact that we only provide support. That was one question. And then the other question was, we have some of these elements in separate policies. Should we submit all relevant policies to Ofsted or combine into one for Ofsted submission purposes?
So your safeguarding policy may be overarching and may reference other policies. So you'd need to have a look and see what those separate ones are. If they are include more detail in those separate policies, then you certainly want to reference it in your main policy that you send over to Ofsted. Right, is that something that we can try and get an answer to in terms of, does that all need to be submitted or can they just refer to other policies?
Yeah, I can get some further clarity. I just wanted to see if there was any
clarification. Yeah, it's a really good question. Thank you. And sorry, there was a question was around care, wasn't there?
Yeah. So it was. Yeah.
So the thoughts on how we balance the desire for safe and effective care with the fact that we only provide support as defined by Ofsted. Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. So in terms of safe and effective care, although the support is what's being provided, obviously children are being accommodated. So I guess it's about how we keep them safe, support themselves to keep themselves safe, developing their independence. But obviously, you know, we have those responsibilities to do everything that we can to keep children safe, thinking about those good overarching safeguarding responsibilities that all organisations that come into contact with children have. If anyone else has any thoughts on that, I'm happy for people to pop something into the chat, or you might want to use that when you're looking at scenarios in your breakout rooms as well. Okay, and I think we've got, yeah, a link to that microsite there. Thank you very much, Raisa. Okay, so I'm going to start having a look at the missing child policy, and then we will take a break. So the missing child policy is a requirement and it sits under Regulation 21 and it relates to that protection standards. Providers need to be aware of that statutory guidance on children who run away or go missing from home or care that I referred to earlier, and that will be set out within your learner handbook as well. The policy sets out the different specific procedures to prevent young people from going missing and any action to take if they do. So your principles around your policy, the guidance is really clear that staff need to maintain good and consistent levels of communication with young people, and where possible, be familiar with their patterns and routines, along with having a good understanding of young people's mental health needs as well. This, of course, is going to be proportionate and balanced against the level of care and supervision that's expected by providers. So it's really important that you're clear with young people from the outset what your expectations are in terms of them letting you know their whereabouts. Such things such as expected times of arrival may support this. And this can be further supported by incorporating care and pathway plans into your procedures and expectations for working with the accommodating authority. It's important that staff remain alert to any situations of concern, and that when they do arise, that they take prompt action if they're unable to make contact or locate a young person when they would be expecting to. Listening to the child is a really important factor in protecting and minimising the chances of them running away. And the Children's Rights Director in 2012 reported that one of the major influences of young people running away is having a sense that they're not being listened to and taken seriously. So particularly around things like placement decisions and moves, and all looked after children should be informed that they have a right to be supported by an independent advocate if they will need to discuss concerns about their placement. And as I said earlier, it's those strong and trusted relationships, and that's where young people should be encouraged by staff to keep people aware of their whereabouts and, you know, appropriate information sharing around their well-being. For young people where there are concerns that they may go missing, and that their care or pathway plan needs to include strategies to minimise those risks and support provided to support that young person to understand those risks and dangers and how they're going to seek help. You need to remember that young people aged 16 and 17 are still children, and when children run away or go missing, they are at increased risk of experiencing things such as sexual exploitation, criminal exploitation, gang involvement, violent crime, drug and alcohol misuse. And research tells us that looked after children are particularly vulnerable to going missing and particularly vulnerable to being exploited. The DfE guidance states that it would not be appropriate for young people who are known to be a risk of going missing to be placed in supported accommodation. However, you need to have those appropriate policies and procedures in place should it happen from your accommodation. So the guidance, the statutory guidance on children who run away or go missing from home or care, sets out the different steps that local authorities and their partners need to take to prevent children from going missing, and also to prevent them from protect them when they do go missing. And local police and local authorities will have in place their local protocols for managing situations when children go missing from their area. Therefore, it's really important that you familiarise yourselves with the local guidance in place and making sure that your policy is in line with that local guidance. Obviously, we have those, we'll talk a bit later about independent return interviews and risk management meetings, and these are organised by the accommodating authority when we have concerns when young people go missing or when they go missing repeatedly. So within your procedures that you're going to be setting out within this policy, you need to have in place the procedures that you'll be following should a young person go missing from the setting. And it needs to set out the different roles and responsibilities of staff. And obviously that's going to depend on your staffing, the size of your setting, the staff within your setting. First thing that's going to need to happen if a young person is deemed as having gone missing is to undertake an assessment of risk. So taking into consideration vulnerabilities of that young person. You know, what do you know about them currently? What are those risks? Where could they potentially be? What risks would they face if they're there? And then obviously considering things such as their mental health and current well-being. Before making a report to the police and any other relevant authorities, obviously the first thing that needs to take once we've undertaken that risk assessment is that attempts to locate them. Before we make any report, so to make sure that we've undertaken those checks. So obviously, first of all, checking that setting, that they're definitely not in the setting anywhere, and then attempting to make contact with that young person, so by phone or any other means, and then looking at those emergency contacts that you have for them, making contact with all of those emergency contacts, and contacting any others that may be relevant, for example, their school or college or employers, if it's somewhere that they should have been attending, to check if they've been seen. we then need to set out, if the decision's made then from that they can't be found and that the police need to be informed, you need to set out within your policy what actions and arrangements you have in place for reporting to the police, the placing authority, if appropriate, parents, any other persons with responsibility, and anyone else that needs to be involved. There needs to be strong recording and reporting arrangements as well. How are you going to be keeping those records of what you've done? What actions have been taken, who you've contacted, so thinking about your records that you're keeping. And then once that young person returns to the setting after being missing, then you need to set out within the policy what actions you'll take. So obviously that's going to initially include informing relevant parties such as the police, that if you've informed them, placing authority, parents, any other professional or persons that's been contacted previously. Any young person who runs away, when they're found, they must be offered an independent return interview, and this is arranged by the responsible accommodating authority. This interview provides an opportunity to uncover information that can help protect children from the risk of going missing again. We'll be considering any risks that they may have been exposed to while they're missing, or any other risk factors that may be in place in the home that they speak about. And staff should take account of any information that's provided through these interviews when assessing risks and putting any further specific arrangements in place in order to protect each young person. We need to be providing ongoing support to young people if they have been missing. So you need to think about, prior to those going missing, so that when young people join your setting, how do you support them to understand the risks that would be associated should they go missing, and what support's available to them to try to prevent that from happening. And obviously if they are going missing and it's something that's happened frequently, then the accommodation authority, there's a requirement for them to convene a risk management meeting, and the registered person will need to attend that meeting. And during that meeting, a strategy is going to be developed in terms of how we can keep that young person safe moving forward. You need to be keeping records, as with everything else, those records of any incident when a young person's going missing, and those records need to be shared with the accommodating and the local authority. Where appropriate, maybe need to be shared with parents as well. And you need to be working with the accommodating authority and any other relevant persons to monitor those incidents and evaluate, to consider things around what's worked well, maybe some changes that you might need to make within your service. Obviously, if you had more than one young person going missing, considering actually what you have in place, do you need to make any changes? Is there any further support needs that are identified? Do you need to make any changes to staff knowledge, skills and training? So looking at an incident, was it dealt with in the way you'd hope it would be dealt with in line with your policy and procedures, or maybe your procedures aren't clear enough, they need updating, or maybe staff weren't really clear or aware of their expectations, so that might need to be refreshed with them through training. So within the handbook, we have some key questions as well around that missing child policy. So it's setting out the roles and responsibilities, actions that you're going to take when a child or young person goes missing, record keeping and how you're going to review them, how you're going to work with other agencies, and support you're going to provide. So again, I've set out within documents and questions, examples being what record you'd be keeping will be kept when a young person goes missing, who should be contacted when a young person is found, how will staff engage with the independent return interview, how will the setting engage with risk management meetings when a young person is frequently missing. That's just an example of some of the questions. Okay, so we will continue. So the requirement for settings to have the behaviour management policy sits under the Regulation 22 and the protection standards. And the policy sets out how appropriate behaviour will be promoted within the service and how young people will be supported to maintain a reasonable standard of behaviour in order to reduce risks and impact of their behaviour on themselves and onto others. Needs to include within it the protocols that you're going to have in place for managing difficult situations and violent behaviour as well, should they occur. Strong and trusted relationships that I've spoken about already as we've gone through today. You know, those relationships between staff and young people support young people around communicating with staff, during which risks and concerns can be discussed and appropriate support provided to young people around keeping them safe. If safeguarding concerns arise, then obviously staff need to be following your safeguarding policy and procedures, and we shouldn't be restricting the movement of young people. Actions taken by staff should be measured, and they need to be proportionate, and they shouldn't cause any unnecessary criminalisation of young people. So the guidance, so we've got looked after children, national protocol. So looked after children and care leavers are overrepresented when we look at the criminal justice system compared to other young people. And the national protocol on reducing unnecessary criminalisation of looked after children and care leavers sets out the best practice for avoiding the criminalisation of looked after children and care leavers where possible. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child includes preventing criminalisation of children, and it highlights the importance of protecting children. And this is a particular concern for young people with additional vulnerabilities, such as those who are looked after or care leavers. A criminal justice response is appropriate in a small number of cases, and the framework aims to prevent the unnecessary criminalisation of children who are already highly vulnerable. So the elements of this part of your policy. So you need to be preparing and implementing a behaviour management policy which sets out the approach to supporting children in order to maintain a reasonable standard of behaviour, to reduce the risk of harm, and also support welfare and the protection of children and other individuals. It should set out the expectations of children in relation to their behaviour and what will happen if those expectations are not met. How the registered person will ensure that children know what those behaviour expectations are. How appropriate behaviour is going to be promoted on the premises. So I'm just aware we've got someone not on mute at the moment. If everyone can just make sure that they're on mute, please. How the registered person is going to deal with challenging behaviour, including methods of de-escalation. How the registered person will be promoting the development of positive and respectful relationships between children who are accommodated and their staff. And we will be talking in a moment about the measures of restraint that may be used in exceptional circumstances in relation to children in supported accommodation. So restraint is something that is included within the guidance, and it's something that certainly questions came up about 2 days ago when we ran this session as well. So I'm just going to go through what the information I've got, and then we'll just see what information I can provide to you that may be useful. So the guidance says that the policy must include measures that will be taken following any exceptional use of restraint. So restraint can include physical techniques, which may involve using force or restricting liberty. The legislation is clear that restraint of a child is only permitted for the purpose of preventing injury to any person, including the child, or serious damage to the property of any person, including the property of the child. Given the assessed needs and autonomy and independence of young people within supported accommodation, restraint should not usually be considered. Should a situation occur, then the policy must be clear on what the procedures are to be followed, including the methods of restraint which may be used in exceptional circumstances. This will include physical restraint being kept to as short a period as necessary, and medical assistance must be obtained if that young person or others are hurt. And following any incident of restraint, a written incident report must be completed by the staff and the registered person. These records would need to be used to learn any lessons and to consider the impact on the young person, and any incident of restraint must be reported to Ofsted as a serious incident. So if there is an incident of restraint, as the guidance makes clear, this would be unusual, but in exceptional circumstances following an incident of restraint, settings should assess the impact of the incident on that young person and consider their relationships with staff and other young people who may be witness to that incident. And appropriate actions need to be taken to manage any of those consequences as well. This could include things like emotional support being provided to that young person by an appropriately trained member of staff as soon as practically possible, but ideally within 24 hours of the incident. Reviews of any incident must be conducted with the young person and any other relevant people, such as their social worker or their personal advisor or any advocates that they have in place. And during this review, young people need to be given the opportunity to feedback on how that incident was handled, so getting their viewpoint on it. And through that review, you need to identify are there any additional support needs that that young person has, and any actions that we need to take to reduce the likelihood of that being needed in the future. And that opportunity to review provides the opportunity to amend any of your practices and policies to ensure that they're lawful and meet the needs of young people. So I'm just going to have a look into the chat. So first question, do we have to call this a behaviour management policy? We prefer positive relationships and placement management. That's a good question. I work closely with lots of organisations that use different terminology. I'm going to leave this one with Risa for a moment. She might be able to clarify. But I think as long as you're clear that this is what this policy is about, then I would have assumed that that would cover you in that. But we will take that back and see if we can get an answer on that, whether it has to be given that title or whether we can use another title. Re-restraint, we've discussed and decided we prefer to avoid this altogether. Is there a requirement to allow this for safety purposes, or are we okay to hold the position? So this is a question that was coming up the other day, and we are seeking further clarification around this, because we understand some settings do have a no restraint policy in place. You need to state that within your policy, that that is the position that you take, and I guess it's about thinking about, should there be an incident in which thinking about what restraint looks like. It could be that a child needs to be some kind of physical handling in order to protect safety in an absolute crisis situation. What would be your viewpoint and your standpoint? What would staff need to do in that situation? But we are seeking clarification on that. If we get that back today, we will let you know today. If we haven't received that clarification today, then that will be part of the information we're taking forward in order to make sure providers are clear on that, so when they're developing their policies. So we will get back to you on that. So in terms of your staff training, the guidance says that staff should receive training to support them in managing situations in order to prevent the need for restraint. So this could include techniques designed to prevent and de-escalate situations, and including safe practices for managing difficult behaviour, and thinking about things like effective conflict management and resolution techniques. The guidance states that even though the use of restraint in supported accommodation is expected to be extremely rare and exceptional in nature, training may, in some cases, extend to the use of safe restraint practices. So in terms of that, apologies, I meant to change this from the other day and I haven't changed it. I will change it after this session. It's not the missing child policy. In terms of the questions that you want to consider for your behaviour management policy, so thinking about the expectations in your setting, what are those expectations for behaviour, and how are they going to be communicated to young people? How will you be promoting them, ensuring that they are understood by all? And what is going to happen if those behaviour expectations aren't met? Think about, in fact, through all of your policies, how are you going to ensure staff build up those strong and trusted relationships between staff and young people, so that we can support around all of these areas of the safeguarding and child protection policies? How are staff going to manage challenging behaviour, including things like managing methods of de-escalation, and thinking about what support you're going to be offering to young people in terms of understanding these expectations, how they can learn and be developing those skills to be able to manage these behaviours if they are occurring. Okay, so bear with me, just moving my screens around a moment. Okay, so this statement of purpose is an important document, and it sits under the leadership and management standard and is within regulation 16 of the regulations. It's an important document setting out the aims and the objectives and the ethos of the service, including what the service offers and how it can meet the needs of young people who may be accommodated within that service. And it sets out how it should set up and be equipped to meet those needs. The information set out in that statement of purpose is an essential part of the process of the agreement between the registered person and the accommodating authority, ensuring that the placement with the provider is the right one for that young person, and that the service is going to be effective in responding to meeting their needs. Accommodation authorities are going to be using that information contained within the statement when they're making their decisions about which service and provider can best meet the needs of that young person. And that statement of purpose needs to be submitted as part of stage 1 of the process. A statement needs to be made available on request to staff, to young people and their parents if required, and to accommodation authorities. And the full information for what needs to be included within the statement of purpose is set out within Regulation 9, and we've included further information within the Learner Handbook as well. I'm not going to cover every single part of the information that needs to be included, because some of it will be, just kind of your very basic required information, setting out the key facts. And what I thought would be more useful to cover within the session are maybe those areas that require a bit more thought and consideration and discussion within your settings about how you're going to prepare that information. So first and foremost, you need to think about your categories that are offered. So it's going to set out those categories of accommodation that you're offering by the service. And if you're delivering more than one category, then making sure that you address each of those categories. And you need to tell Ofsted which category or categories you're applying to operate supported accommodation under at the point of registration. And you need to, as registered persons, need to demonstrate that they have the capacity and appropriate experience and skills to manage or carry on that service, having regard to the category or categories of supported accommodation that are going to be provided or are already being provided. So in terms of the accommodation, you need to provide a description of the accommodation, and this includes what is currently in place, but also how you might be able to adapt that accommodation to meet the individual needs of children that are accommodated, and it needs to set out also the security arrangements that are in place. And then in terms of the services and facilities, it needs to include a description of what the service offers, how this can meet the needs of prospective young people who may be accommodated in the service, and how it's set up and equipped to meet those needs. Needs to cover the characteristics of young people that the service intends to provide accommodation and support to. So this would be according to their needs and or level of autonomy, who would be suitable for and would thrive within that setting. This is going to include things such as the age range of the accommodation intends to take, the number of young people who can be accommodated within that setting, and whether it's a mixed or single sex provision. And then moving on to the support, what level of support is offered by the service? And this will include details such as the arrangements that are in place to support young people with special educational needs and disabilities, those that have health needs, and this will include mental health. And this information supports accommodation authorities in matching young people to the right accommodation that's going to be able to meet their needs. And so this will link in with the support standard. Staffing levels within the service and within settings needs to be set out, and these need to meet the needs of young people, and ensuring some flexibility to be able to respond to unexpected events or opportunities. And staffing structures should be able to promote continuity of support from the young person's perspective. If the needs of young people mean that staff are not required to be on site 24 hours a day, then there must be arrangements in place to ensure the safety and ongoing support of young people, including access to 24/7 on-call support. So thinking about what that looks like and setting that out within that statement of purpose. The degree of staff involvement in each setting needs to be set out so that young people and local authorities are clear about what they can expect. And this is obviously going to be dependent on the needs of the young people that are accommodated within that setting. And the statement needs to set out how staff are going to work effectively as a team in order to meet young people's needs. And there should therefore, making sure that they have the right level of experience and skills in being able to do so. But as with all of your policies, you are expected to keep your statement of purpose under review once registered, to make sure that the focus remains on young people and the service that's provided, and individualised support that's going to meet those quality standards and improve those outcomes for young people. Any review of the statement of purpose needs to take into consideration feedback that's been received. That could be from young people or from staff or others, any complaints that have been raised by young people, making sure that if we're making changes to the statement of purpose, that these are there to have a positive impact on young people. Once you've got your statement of purpose in place, then the registered person must make sure that that service and setting is conducted in line with that statement of purpose. And obviously, if there needs to be changes to that, then those changes do occur in line with those reviews. Any updates to statements should be made when necessary, and young people need to be informed if there's any changes made to that statement of purpose, particularly if they're going to impact on them and the reason for that. And Ofsted must be informed of any revisions and provided with a copy within 28 days of any revised statements of purpose. So in terms of thinking about the key questions that you're going to be asking, as I said, it is quite a lot of information that's required within there. They're going to look at obviously considering your categories and your characteristics, the accommodation, so detailing that, what services and support are offered, thinking about your staffing, so thinking about support that's offered and how you're going to be reviewing. So within the document that you'll have in the microsite, looking at those key questions, some of the things I've put in there would be questions such as what are the security arrangements, how would you describe the accommodation, what are your staffing levels, how are staff going to respond to unexpected events or opportunities, what degree of staff involvement is in place, how are you going to ensure that staff have the right level of experience and skills to support young people and meet their needs. So I'm just having a look into the chat. There are a lot of details to include here, are duplicated in more detail elsewhere, e.g. the workforce plan. Can we just put summary in the summary and cross-reference? Okay, that's a good question. I'm going to leave that one in the chat for Risa just to see if we do have any answers to that at the moment, Risa, and if not, if that's something that we can take forward as a question. So in terms of, thank you. So yeah, Rice is going to seek some clarity. We'll either get some information. If we can't get information back today, as I said, we'll be taking forward any questions from any of the sessions that we've not been able to answer on the day, and try and seek some answers to those and get that out to people. So in terms of the case records, Regulation 24 sets out the case records that supported accommodation providers must keep, and Schedule 2 lists those records that must be kept in place. And these sit under the protection standards. So records on each young person are really, really important. They represent a significant contribution to their life history, and they therefore should represent an accurate account of that period in a young person's life. The guidance is really clear that staff need to understand the important role that they have in encouraging young people to reflect on and understand their history according to their needs. So in terms of the guidances we have in place, obviously the supported accommodation regulations, and I mentioned those information sharing guidance, which I'm going to talk about a bit more in a bit, which is currently under consultation at the moment, and also but understanding your local safeguarding partner policy and procedures as well. So all of you should get to know your local safeguarding partnership. There might be a few different ones if you've got settings in a number of different areas, but understanding the ones that where your settings are within, understanding their local protocols, policies and procedures, particularly around things like information sharing, are really important for you to be aware of. So what are the requirements? In order to have good record keeping, we need to make sure that they're up to date. And it's really important. Strong records show, not just for young people, obviously it's very important. Young people are able to access information that gives them information about that part of their lives, but equally your decision making, your actions that you're taking, having that clear record of those, opportunities to learn from situations that occur. We're only going to be able to review them thoroughly afterwards if we've got those good clear records of what happened at the time and the decisions that were made, and be able to cross-reference those to your policies and procedures, and do you need to make any changes to any of those. If you're using paper records, then they need to be signed and dated by the author of each entry. If you're using electronic records, it needs to be really clear who has produced that record. I would be avoiding initials. I'd be saying full names and designation of staff should be used so that we can go back if we need to in the future, and speak to staff about why decisions were made. In the future, if records are going to be seen by others and things need to be redacted, it's actually easier to redact full names, and then sometimes you miss things in the initials, particularly if they're an initial that is the same as a word. So for example, IN as an initial might be not picked up because it would read in. So actually, if you've got full names of people, it's easier to go through and redact that information later, should you need to do that. The guidance is really clear that case records must not stigmatise young people, and that they need to be objective and they need to be helpful. So thinking about your staff training, how are you going to support staff to understand what a good record looks like through good quality training? And when staff maybe produce records that aren't accurate, or maybe veer into opinions that aren't stated as opinions, or maybe information that you wouldn't really want a young person to read about themselves because of the way it's written, and actually going back to that person and looking at how we can rewrite that so that they're helpful records. So we need to be making sure that we distinguish between facts and opinions and any third-party information. So if that information has come from someone else, who's that come from? So it's really, really clear. Needs to be recorded in a way that's going to be helpful to that young person if they're looking back at their records, and helpful to us if you're in supported accommodation, but also helpful to other professionals in the future should they need access to your records as well. So what are your responsibilities towards young people? And they're significant around their case records. So then we really must support them to understand that we keep records about them and what records we keep. Openness and transparency is something that's really, really important within record keeping. When we're keeping information about other people, they should know what we're keeping about them and why, and how they can access those records. And they need to be actively encouraged to read their records and supported to do so. And they should be supported to add further information from their point of view into their records as well. Some young people may not want to see their records now, but they need to understand that they have the right to access these records at any point in their lives, and how they can do that, particularly once they move on from your setting, that they have that information of where they can go to get access to those records in the future. So it's through that induction process and through staff training, really ensuring that staff are familiar with the settings, with your policies and procedures around record keeping, familiar with what records are kept, and also the why. Apologies. If staff understand the why and the importance of good record keeping, it will improve your records. If they're not really clear about why these records are kept, you might just see they're of low quality, or maybe not completed at all when they're supposed to be. So they need to be really familiar with that, and really understanding the importance of having careful records and objective and really clear records. And they need to be familiar with the information sharing requirements that should be set out within your procedures, but also that are set out within that non-statutory guidance that I spoke about. So this is from that non-statutory guidance, that information sharing guidance is currently under consultation for update. It sets out within there 7 golden rules for information sharing. Sorry, I got a bit of a frog in my throat, just bear with me a moment. So we may think about GDPR, so those general data protection regulations, data protection acts and human rights laws, and sometimes we can be worried about information sharing, and we're right to be hesitant around information sharing, because we do need to share information at times, but we need to make sure that when we do it in the right way. So those regulations do not stop us from sharing information when we need to. They're not barriers to sharing. They're about providing a helpful, supportive framework to make sure that people's personal information is shared when it needs to be shared with the right people, and so that we have those correct considerations, rather than having a let's not share any information. Because actually, when we look at child safeguarding practice reviews and other reviews when things have gone wrong, we often see that there have been concerns raised around information sharing, in the fact that information hasn't been shared, and that people have held on to information that should have been shared in order to protect young people. So it's really important that you are open and honest, so that clarity with young people about the records that you keep, with their parents if required, if that's appropriate, and with their professionals that are involved in their lives. Everyone knows what records are kept and why, and that we're keeping those records securely, and only people that should have access to them have access to them. we need to seek advice if we're not sure about information sharing. Seeking advice around that to make sure that we're making the right decisions. When we share people's information, including young people's, on the whole, we will inform them that we're sharing. And actually the updated guidance around information sharing is going to talk a little bit more about consent and what that means, because sometimes consent isn't just that someone agrees. Sometimes consent is that they might not agree with our decision making, but actually it's in their best interest that we share that information anyway. So we're informing them that we're sharing their information because it's to protect them or others. And if they don't agree with that, we'll keep a record of their views, because their views are really valid. But if it's to protect them, then it might still need to be shared if there's a good reason to do so. What you're always going to consider is safety and well-being for everyone involved. And if you're making a decision to share information, then you're going to make sure that the information that you share is necessary. That is proportionate. So how much do we share of that information? We don't necessarily need to share everything. Consider what we're sharing. It needs to be relevant. Why are we sharing it? Is it relevant to this situation? It needs to be adequate. So it needs to be enough information for people to make some decisions or to protect. It needs to be timely. So we're not sitting on information. If it needs to be shared, we're sharing it in a timely fashion, and thinking about secure sharing of information. So if you're sharing information by email, for example, and it's confidential information, thinking about how you're protecting that, such as password protected documents or other ways, and making sure that you're really clear with staff if they're sharing information in that manner, how they share it, that it's done securely, and obviously anything by post or other means that it's secure. Whenever we share people's information, we need to be keeping a record of that. So the decision of why we're sharing it, who we're sharing it with, and why we're sharing it all needs to be kept a good, accurate record of that. So we can look back in the future and say, yes, we shared that information and this was our decision making around it. As long as you can justify your decision making around it, that it's in order to protect someone, then you'll be supported in that. So in terms of the case records that need to be held, so Schedule 2 of the legislation sets out the full details of those records. So these would include personal details. Obviously, you'll have details of that young person's name and date of birth and sex, religion, ethnicity, address, etc. Contact details that you'll be holding for other people in relation to that child. So that could be their parents or other person with parental responsibility or other family members. Any professional involved, so social workers, anyone else in the placing authority, their school, their college, their employer, any advocates that they have, or any other professionals that are involved in their lives, making sure we've got clear records of the names of the people and how we can contact them as well. Any information that we have relating to the care, protection or safety of the child. So they've been covered within our earlier policies around our safeguarding policies, things like missing incidents, if they are to be any restraints and restraint incidents, any incidents of self-harming, also including in there any restrictions on contact between that young person and others. So if there's any court or other ordered contact restrictions, so it could be between them and their parents or any other person, that we've got a clear record of that. You'll need to keep any plans or reports that relate to that child. So it could be their education healthcare plan if they have one in place, any school or college reports about them, and any other relevant plan that's in place for that child, such as things like their placement plan, their care plan, their pathway plan, any other plan that's been prepared by that accommodating authority in relation to things like remand or sentencing of the child. And we'll be holding health information as well. So health information will include their GP details, records of any accidents or injuries that's happened to them under your, when they've been living within your accommodation, any immunisations, any allergies, any relevant health information or medical information that you hold, developmental tests, could be dental, medical needs, and any medication information, including those that are being self-administered. So on the whole, young people will self-administer and they will hold their medication, but you need to know what that medication is that they have been prescribed so that you're aware of that, and you can fully support them then in administering their own medication. So in terms of your storage and retention, it's really important that all case records are held securely. So think about what that looks like in each setting, how are they held, and that they're only accessible by the people who should have access to them. contain confidential information. So it's really important that we consider that. So in terms of your record retention, this needs to be set out within your policies and procedures. They should be kept for 75 years from the child's date of birth, unless the child dies before the age of 18, in which case they're going to be kept for 15 years from the date of death. You must have procedures in place for retention of records in the situation in which the setting closes down. So if the setting closes and it remains under a provider that's still open, but it's just that particular setting's closed,